The storm's arrival. A blizzard raged across the frozen expanse, howling like a beast prowling the land. The wind battered the old cabin, its wooden walls groaning in protest. Inside, Ethan Carver sat by the fireplace, nursing a mug of coffee, his fingers absently tracing the rim. He liked the isolation. The quiet. Then came the knock. A single, weak thud against the heavy wooden door. Ethan frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors, no one should be out in this weather. His nearest neighbor was miles away. Another knock. Softer this time. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious. But something about the sound, the desperation in it, made him move. He grabbed his coat and cautiously unlatched the door. A figure collapsed against him. She was barely conscious, wrapped in a thin cloak already crusted with ice. Long strands of silver-white hair clung to her face, and her lips were blue from the cold. Ethan cursed under his breath and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. The storm's arrival. The wind shrieked outside like a living thing, battering against the cabin walls. Snow piled high against the windows, threatening to bury everything in its frozen grasp. Inside, Ethan Carver sat beside the crackling fire, staring into the flickering flames. The storm had come suddenly, a violent blizzard sweeping across the wilderness. He had checked the radio earlier, there were warnings about the cold, but no mention of anything this severe. Still, he was used to the solitude, used to nature's unpredictable wrath. Then came the knock. A single, weak thud against the heavy wooden door. Ethan frowned. No one should be out in this weather. His nearest neighbor was more than 10 miles away, and he hadn't seen another person in weeks. Another knock. Softer this time. He stood, setting his mug of coffee down. Instinct told him to be cautious, but something in that sound, the desperation of it, made him move. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall and approached the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind's howl. No response. Cautiously, he unlatched the door and pulled it open. A figure slumped forward, collapsing into his arms. She was barely conscious, wrapped in a tattered cloak already crusted with ice. Long strands of silver-white hair clung to her face, her skin an unnatural pale blue. Her lips were nearly frozen, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, hoisting her up and carrying her inside. He kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the storm. Laying her gently on the couch, he quickly grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her. Her clothes, if they could be called that, were thin and ragged, offering no protection from the brutal cold. She should have been dead. Ethan knelt beside her, checking her pulse. Weak, but there. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, revealing irises of shimmering violet. A strange color. Unnatural. She tried to speak, but her voice was a faint whisper. "Help." Ethan sighed. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough about survival to get her stable. He hurried to the kitchen, grabbing a thermos of warm water, then returned to her side. "Here, drink this," he said, lifting her head slightly. She sipped weakly, some color returning to her cheeks. Ethan studied her as she drank. Something about her was off. Not just her unusual features, but the way she moved, the way her skin shimmered faintly under the firelight. Who was she? And what the hell was she doing out in a storm like this? "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She winced, as if even speaking was painful. Ethan sighed. "All right. We'll figure that out later. Just rest." He stood, retrieving a spare blanket from the closet. He draped it over her carefully, then took a step back, watching her slow, steady breathing. This was supposed to be a quiet night. Just him, the storm, and the crackling fire. Instead, he had an unconscious stranger in his cabin, one who, he suspected, wasn't entirely human. And he had no idea what that meant for him. The stranger's secret. Ethan sat in his worn-out armchair, watching the mysterious woman as she slept. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows along the cabin walls. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, the silence between them felt just as heavy. She stirred, her breath becoming more even. Her skin, which had been unnervingly cold before, now held a faint warmth. Ethan exhaled, relieved. He had seen plenty of people succumb to the elements in his time out here, some never woke up. But she had. Her violet eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan leaned forward. "You all right?" She blinked a few times before nodding, though it was a slow, uncertain movement. She tried to sit up, only to wince and fall back onto the couch. "Easy," he said. "You're lucky to be alive. I don't know how long you were out in that storm, but you shouldn't even be breathing right now." She opened her mouth as if to respond, but hesitated. Her gaze flicked around the cabin, taking in the fire, the blankets, and finally, Ethan himself. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "My cabin. Middle of nowhere," Ethan answered. "I found you on my doorstep. You're lucky I was here." She frowned slightly, as if confused by the words. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What's your name?" Again, she hesitated. Finally, she whispered, "Naira." It sounded strange on her tongue, like she wasn't used to saying it. Ethan filed that away in the back of his mind. "All right, Naira. You want to tell me how you ended up in a blizzard wearing that?" He gestured to her thin, tattered clothing. Naira didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at herself, almost surprised by what she was wearing. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, and for the first time, Ethan saw something truly strange. Her nails weren't normal. They were faintly translucent, shifting colors depending on how the firelight hit them. Almost crystalline. Ethan felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the realization creeping into his mind. She wasn't just some lost hiker. Something was off about her. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, as if she were struggling with the words. "I was running." "From what?" Naira flinched at the question. She glanced toward the door as if expecting something, or someone, to barge in. Ethan followed her gaze. The storm was still going strong. No one in their right mind would be outside in that. Still, his gut told him she wasn't just being paranoid. "I can't go back," she whispered. "They'll find me." Ethan's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. He had seen enough people on the run in his life, but never like this. She didn't look afraid of some ordinary threat, no, this was something deeper. "Who's after you?" he asked. Naira bit her lip. "You shouldn't be involved." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Too late for that, sweetheart. You collapsed at my door. I think I deserve some answers." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, hesitation, then regret. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand. Ethan watched as her fingers shimmered again, the color shifting in an unnatural way. Before he could ask what she was doing, a faint glow formed around her palm. It was soft, barely noticeable at first, but then it pulsed, an eerie, silver-blue light. The air around them grew thick, humming with an energy Ethan had never felt before. "What the hell?" he breathed. "I'm not like you," Naira said quietly. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't know how to respond. His mind raced with possibilities, each one crazier than the last. Then, she closed her hand into a fist, and the glow disappeared as if it had never been there. Silence fell between them. Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. So. You're not human. Naira didn't answer, but she didn't need to. After a long pause, Ethan leaned back in his chair. Great. Just my luck. Naira studied him, as if expecting panic or fear. But Ethan had seen too much in his life to lose his mind over something like this. He had questions, a lot of them, but right now, one thing mattered more than anything else. Whoever you're running from, he said, looking her in the eye, are they coming here? Naira hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, yes. Outside, the wind howled, as if warning them of what was coming. Hunted in the storm. Ethan felt the weight of Naira's answer settle deep in his gut. Yes. Whoever, or whatever, she was running from, they were coming. And he had just thrown himself into the middle of it. The fire crackled between them, casting shifting shadows on the log walls of his cabin. Naira sat on the couch, pale and exhausted, but her violet eyes flickered with alertness. She was listening. So was he. For a long moment, only the wind raged outside. Then, barely audible through the storm, a distant hum vibrated through the walls. It wasn't the wind. Ethan stood up slowly. His old instincts kicked in, the ones he had tried to leave behind when he came out here. The ones that had saved his life before. Naira was already watching him, her fingers gripping the blanket draped over her shoulders. How many? He asked, keeping his voice low. She closed her eyes for a second as if sensing something. When she opened them again, she looked paler than before. 2, she whispered. But they won't be alone. They never are. Ethan didn't like the sound of that. Armed? He asked. Naira hesitated, then nodded. Yes. But not like your weapons. Great. Just great. Ethan moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just an inch. The snowfall made it impossible to see far, but he wasn't looking for details. He was looking for movement. A flicker of shifting shadows. A break in the swirling white. Then he saw it. Something dark, low to the ground, moving between the trees. His stomach tightened. That wasn't a person. He let the curtain fall back into place and turned to Naira. What the hell was that? She swallowed. A hunter. Ethan didn't like the way she said the word. It wasn't a title. It was a warning. They're fast, she said. Stronger than you. And once they have a scent, she trailed off, but he got the message. No escape. Ethan exhaled sharply. He had no idea what she could do, but she had barely been able to sit up an hour ago. Whatever power she had, she wouldn't be using it anytime soon. Which meant it was up to him. He crossed the room in a few strides, heading for the locked cabinet near the door. Naira's gaze followed him. What are you doing? Ethan pulled open the cabinet, revealing an old hunting rifle, a pistol, and a long combat knife. He took the pistol first, checking the magazine. Then he grabbed the knife, securing it at his belt. Preparing. They aren't like you, Naira said again. Your weapons. We'll slow them down, Ethan finished. And sometimes, that's all you need. Naira watched him, something unreadable in her expression. Listen, he said, kneeling down so they were eye level. You need to tell me exactly what they want. Do they want to kill you? She hesitated. Not at first. That wasn't comforting. Then what? They want to take me back, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Back where? Naira's fingers curled against the blanket. Home. Ethan studied her face. She didn't sound relieved. She sounded terrified. Something wasn't adding up. Isn't that a good thing? He asked carefully. Naira shook her head. Ethan exhaled. He didn't have time to untangle whatever mess she was in, but one thing was clear, she didn't want to go back. And if these things were willing to track her through a blizzard, they weren't giving up. The humming outside grew louder. Ethan glanced at the door. "Can you stand?" Naira nodded, though she was clearly struggling. "Good," he said. "Because we're not staying here." She blinked. "What?" "They're expecting us to be inside," he said. "Which means staying here is a death sentence." Naira's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Ethan grabbed his coat and an extra one for her. She pulled it on, though it was oversized on her. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting out before the hunters reached the cabin. He moved toward the back door. Naira followed, her steps quiet despite her exhaustion. Ethan opened the door as slowly as possible, wincing at the cold blast of air that hit them. The trees loomed dark and tall beyond the clearing. Their best chance was slipping into the forest before the hunters reached the front. "Stay close," Ethan murmured. Naira nodded. Then they stepped out into the storm. Hunted through the storm. The cold hit Naira like a slap to the face, but she forced herself to move. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed Ethan into the trees. The wind howled, carrying the eerie hum of the hunters searching for them. She didn't dare look back. Ethan led the way, moving quickly but carefully. He was built for this: survival, danger, the unknown. Even in the thick snow, he moved like a predator, like someone who had been through worse and lived to tell the tale. Naira, on the other hand, was struggling. Her legs were weak, her body barely recovering from the crash. The only thing keeping her upright was fear. And something else. She glanced at Ethan's back, his broad frame blocking the worst of the wind for her. He didn't hesitate. He didn't abandon her. Why? She was a stranger. Worse, a burden. Yet, here he was, guiding her through the storm, protecting her from the creatures that wanted to drag her back. The thought sent a cold shiver through her, not from the wind, but from the memories she had tried to bury. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the storm. Naira's breath caught in her throat. They were close. Ethan turned slightly, eyes scanning the trees. His hand hovered near the pistol strapped to his side. "They're tracking us," he murmured. "How do we lose them?" She swallowed. "You don't." Ethan's jaw clenched. Not the answer he wanted. Naira closed her eyes for a brief second, reaching for the part of her mind she had been ignoring, the part that made her different. The part that made her theirs. A flicker of awareness stretched through her senses. 3. No, 4 hunters. Spreading out. Surrounding them. "They're trying to corner us," she whispered. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then we don't let them." He grabbed her hand. Naira stiffened at the warmth of his grip, but she didn't pull away. "This way," he said, pulling her to the left. They moved fast, dodging low-hanging branches and uneven snowdrifts. The wind carried distant growls, closer now. Naira's heartbeat thundered in her ears. A shadow flickered in the trees ahead. Too fast. Too close. "Down," Ethan hissed. He shoved her behind a thick tree trunk just as something huge lunged past them. It moved like liquid darkness, 4 legs and a shifting, unnatural body. The hunter. Naira pressed a hand against her mouth, forcing herself to stay silent. The creature slowed, sniffing the air. Ethan lifted his pistol slowly. Carefully. A gunshot in the storm would give them away, but at this range. Crack. The shot rang out, striking the hunter in the side. It let out a strangled snarl, stumbling. Ethan grabbed Naira's wrist. "Run." They didn't wait to see if it recovered. They ran. Branches whipped against their faces, snow swallowing their steps. The wind howled, masking their movements. Then, a shape dropped from above. Naira barely had time to react before another hunter landed in front of them. No time to stop. No time to turn back. The creature lunged. Ethan fired. The bullet struck its shoulder, knocking it sideways for a split second, but a split second was all Naira needed. She moved on instinct. A surge of something hot pulsed through her veins, snapping outward. The air around them rippled, invisible force slamming into the creature. It screeched, thrown backward into a tree. The trunk cracked under the impact. Naira stumbled, gasping. Ethan stared at her. What the hell was that? She didn't know how to answer. Another howl rose in the storm. The others were coming. They couldn't keep running. Not like this. Ethan cursed under his breath. We need a new plan. Naira forced herself to stand tall, ignoring the exhaustion seeping into her bones. There's a cave nearby, she said, voice strained. I can sense it. Ethan studied her. Then he nodded. Lead the way. Naira turned, pushing forward through the storm. Behind them, the hunters closed in. They just had to reach the cave. They just had to survive. The choice that changed everything. The storm raged behind them, but Naira barely noticed. Her body was running on instinct, her legs pushing through the deep snow with the last of her strength. The cave was close. She could feel it, a pocket of safety hidden within the frozen wilderness. Ethan kept pace beside her, his breath sharp and controlled. He hadn't asked how she knew where to go. Not yet. Because the hunters were still coming. A shadow moved at the corner of her vision. Too fast. Too close. Get down, Ethan shoved her forward just as something slashed through the air where her head had been. Naira hit the snow hard, rolling as a massive hunter landed between them. It didn't hesitate. It lunged for Ethan. Naira's mind screamed, no. Her power surged forward, raw and untamed. The air cracked like thunder as an invisible force slammed into the hunter, launching it backward into the trees. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, shaking the very earth beneath them. Ethan scrambled to his feet, eyes wide. What the hell was that? Naira didn't answer. She couldn't. Her head was spinning, her pulse erratic. She had never used that much power before, not like that. The hunters howled in the distance. More were coming. We have to move, she gasped, grabbing Ethan's arm. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. They ran. The cave entrance came into view, a dark opening in the frozen cliffside, half hidden by heavy snowfall. Relief crashed over Naira. They had made it. She staggered inside, pressing herself against the cold rock as Ethan followed, gun still raised. Silence. For the first time since the chase began, there was only the sound of their breathing. Naira's legs finally gave out. She sank to the ground, exhausted. Ethan crouched beside her. You okay? She nodded weakly. Just, drained. He exhaled, watching her carefully. His gaze flickered to the entrance. They won't stop hunting you, will they? Naira's throat tightened. No, she admitted. They won't. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, he sat down beside her, gun resting across his lap. You gonna tell me what you are? She swallowed. You already know. Alien, he said. Not a question. Naira nodded. He didn't move. Didn't reach for his weapon. Didn't run. Instead, he sighed. Figured. Something inside Naira cracked. She had spent so long hiding. Running. Being feared. But Ethan wasn't afraid of her. Why are they after you? He asked. Naira closed her eyes. Because I left. Ethan frowned. She took a shaky breath. I was created to be a weapon. Designed to fight. Kill. But I didn't want that. Her voice broke. I didn't want to be a monster. Ethan was quiet. Then. You're not a monster. Her eyes snapped to him. You don't know that. He looked at her, steady and sure. I know you saved my life. Twice. Naira's heart pounded. Ethan leaned back against the cave wall, staring at the ceiling. So what now? She swallowed. I don't know. If she stayed, the hunters would never stop coming. If she left. She looked at Ethan. He had risked everything for her. Saved her when he had no reason to. Would he let her go? Did she even want to? Ethan sighed. Guess we'll figure it out together. Naira's chest tightened. For the first time in a long, long time. She wasn't alone.